The red sun hung low over Viralia 4, its crimson hue staining the sky like spilled blood. The colony was quiet in the early hours, the stillness of dawn disrupted only by the hum of irrigation drones tending to fields of grain. Children chased each other through the open markets, while merchants opened their stalls, unaware that their lives, their futures, were already gone. Kieran Valdris watched from the outskirts, his heart a cold knot in his chest. The people here were blissfully ignorant of the horrors looming on the edge of their existence. He had come to warn them, but his warnings had been met with polite dismissal. Another vagabond, they thought. Another ghost chasing shadows. But Kieran knew the truth. He'd seen the signs. The world trembled with the quiet that always preceded slaughter. The sky cracked. At first, it seemed like an ordinary storm, a faint shimmer in the upper atmosphere. But then the clouds ripped open, revealing jagged obsidian shapes descending like spears from the heavens. The Zhorax dreadships burned through the clouds, their sleek organic hulls thrumming with the pulse of living engines. They were alive in every sense of the word, predatory, calculating things designed to kill. Panic erupted in the colony as the first ship released a shimmering gelatinous pod. It hit the ground with a wet thunk, splitting apart to reveal a mass of writhing tendrils. The tendrils elongated and twisted, forming the silhouette of a Zhorax hunter, an emaciated figure with translucent, twitching skin stretched taut over its grotesque frame. Its twin jaws clicked together, a wet hiss of hunger reverberating across the square. Kieran didn't hesitate. He grabbed a young boy frozen in terror and pulled him to safety just as the Zhorax sprang forward. It moved with horrifying precision, its tendrils uncoiling and lashing around a fleeing man's neck. The man screamed as the appendages burrowed into his flesh, spreading like a parasitic infection. The blood drained from his body within seconds, his skin collapsing into pale folds. Chaos consumed the colony. People sprinted in every direction, only to be met by more pods crashing down, their impacts shaking the streets. More hunters emerged, their movements fluid yet wrong, as if their limbs had too many joints. Their talons, thin as bone needles, punctured effortlessly through flesh and bone. They didn't just kill, they drained. Their purpose was methodical. The colony was not being attacked, it was being harvested. Kieran pushed the boy into the arms of a fleeing woman and turned toward the chaos. He couldn't leave, not this time. He tore off the leather bracer on his left forearm, revealing a tattoo-like emblem, a crimson sigil representing his Irindral bloodline. He felt the familiar pulse of heat as his blood responded, veins blackening beneath his skin. His vision sharpened, his muscles coiled like steel cables. But the power came with agony, a burning sensation that crawled through his nerves like fire ants. He moved before the pain could slow him down. The first Zhorax hunter lunged, its talons slashing toward his throat. Kieran dodged, his reflexes heightened by the mutation. He grabbed a broken metal pipe from the debris and swung it with brutal precision, caving in the creature's thin skull. Bones splintered with a wet crack, and the hunter's body spasmed before crumpling. A second Zhorax surged toward him, its jaws distending wide enough to swallow his head whole. Kieran planted his feet and drove the pipe through its chest. A fountain of thick, violet ichor sprayed out. But instead of dying, the creature writhed and began pulling itself further down the pipe, desperate to close the distance. Its hollow eyes reflected no pain, only hunger. Kieran snarled and twisted the pipe until it shredded the creature's insides. With a final hiss, it fell limp. His reprieve was short-lived. Across the colony, the scene was carnage. Entire families were being dragged from their homes and bled dry. A mother screamed as she tried to shield her child, only for both of them to be impaled by a Zhorax tendril that fused their corpses in a grotesque tangle of flesh. Kieran's stomach twisted. He wanted to look away, but he knew that he couldn't. Every failure etched itself into his soul, another reminder that he had waited too long. A familiar voice cut through the noise. "Kieran!" He turned to see Leora sprinting toward him, her medic's pack slung over one shoulder, her face pale but determined. Behind her was Zhorax, who leveled his plasma rifle and fired a round into a Zhorax leaping toward them. The shot tore the alien apart mid-air, its body landing in a heap. "We need to move," Zhorax barked. Kieran nodded, but his gaze drifted toward the colony's central hub, a reinforced communications tower surrounded by fuel tanks. His mind raced. "We need to blow that tower," he said grimly. Leora's eyes widened. "Are you insane? There are still people." "They're not stopping." Kieran's voice was hoarse. He gestured to the dreadships overhead, where more pods were already descending. "The Zhorax will bleed this colony dry unless we cripple their landing zone." Zhorax cursed but didn't argue. "Then let's make it count." Together they sprinted toward the tower, weaving through wreckage and bodies. The stench of iron and rot clung to the air. Kieran's body protested with every step. The effects of his blood-fueled abilities gnawed at his muscles. He forced himself onward, shoving the pain aside. When they reached the tower, Zhorax rigged a makeshift charge using scavenged fuel cells. Leora provided cover fire as more Zhorax closed in. One of the creatures reached her and lashed out with its tendrils. She screamed as the barbs raked across her arm, but she kept firing even as blood soaked her sleeve. "Kieran!" Zhorax shouted. "It's ready!" Kieran grabbed Leora, dragging her away from the tower. Zhorax followed, detonator in hand. The Zhorax swarmed the base of the tower, oblivious to the ticking countdown. They barely made it behind cover when the explosion erupted. A shockwave of fire and shrapnel tore through the air, obliterating the communications tower. The force hurled Zhorax bodies in every direction, their translucent skin blistering from the heat. The dreadships overhead wavered as the disruption scrambled their signals. The colony was still burning, but for the first time the Zhorax advance faltered. Kieran slumped against a shattered wall, his breathing ragged. Leora's face was tight with pain, her injured arm trembling. Zhorax sat beside them, his face smeared with soot. "It's not enough," Leora whispered. "They'll come back." "I know," Kieran muttered. He looked up at the sky where the surviving dreadships began to ascend. "But at least now, they know we'll fight." In the distance, the surviving colonists fled toward the wilderness. Kieran closed his eyes, trying to ignore the faces of those they couldn't save. The Zhorax had shown their hand. They weren't just invaders. They were butchers. And this was only the beginning. He clenched his fist, feeling the slow pulse of his corrupted blood. His ancestors had been hunted to extinction. their legacy reduced to whispers and scars. Not again. This time he would make the universe bleed. The sky over Virelia 4 still burned in Kieran's memory as he navigated the worn-out frigate, its engines rattling with every shift in speed. He'd salvaged the ship after the escape. It was barely space-worthy, but it was enough to get him off-world, enough to start his mission. He gripped the controls, eyes hollow from sleepless nights, the weight of failure a constant pressure on his chest. Virelia had been a warning. Humanity was outmatched, hunted. Alone, they didn't stand a chance. Kieran needed fighters, people who wouldn't flinch in the face of horror, who could see what the Zhorax were doing and still fight back. The console beeped as the frigate broke through the dense rings of a dying planet. Ahead, bathed in the amber glow of the system's collapsing star, was the Shatterfield, a treacherous debris zone littered with shattered ships from a war centuries past. Somewhere within that drifting graveyard was Zhorax Tauros. Zhorax had been a legend on the outer systems, a bounty hunter who'd taken contracts against entire warlords. Now he lived as an outlaw, hiding in the remnants of broken fleets, surrounded by scrap and dead worlds. Kieran's message had been simple: meet me, or the universe dies screaming. As Kieran's ship approached the agreed-upon coordinates, an energy surge lit up his sensors. A jagged asteroid shifted, and from behind it came a massive, rusted vessel covered in makeshift plating. The Obsidian Grin, Zhorax's ship. Its cannons swiveled toward Kieran's frigate. "Always a dramatic entrance," Kieran muttered, opening the comm channel. The view screen crackled to life, revealing Zhorax's face, scarred, reptilian, with slit pupil eyes that glimmered like molten gold. His grin exposed rows of jagged teeth. "Kieran Valdris," Zhorax drawled, his voice deep and rough like crushed stone. "I was starting to think you died along with your people." "Not yet," Kieran replied, "but we will if you don't help." Zhorax leaned closer, his scaled face filling the screen. "You want to take on the Zhorax, and you think I'm suicidal?" Kieran's eyes darkened. "They're building blood farms across the sector, humans hooked up like cattle, drained until they're empty. If that doesn't make your blood boil, then maybe you're not the killer everyone says you are." Zhorax was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back, folding his massive arms. "I'm listening." The next stop was Varnus Station, an orbital outpost infamous for scavengers, black market dealers, and fugitives. It was here that Kieran sought Nissa Morrow. The station's corridors were a labyrinth of rusted metal and flickering lights. The air reeked of machine oil and sweat. Kieran moved carefully, his hand brushing the grip of his sidearm. He found Nissa in a back-alley bar called The Hollows, sitting alone at a booth beneath a dim red light. She was thinner than the last time he'd seen her, her frame gaunt, her face sharp and pale. She wore a reinforced flight jacket, the sleeves torn away to reveal the gnarled veins of scar tissue that twisted across her arms and neck, souvenirs from her time inside a Zhorax blood facility. Kieran approached slowly. "Nissa." She didn't look up. "You're either brave or stupid coming here." "Probably both." He slid into the booth across from her. Up close, he could see the faint twitch beneath her skin, the parasitic organ embedded in her ribs subtly pulsing. "How long do you have?" Nisa's eyes were hollow. "A few weeks, maybe less." She finally looked at him, and he could see the pain she'd carried since her escape. Her body was a battleground, and the parasite implanted by the Zhorax had left her permanently scarred. It coiled beneath her flesh, feeding off her, keeping her weak, but alive. "You're not here to pity me," Nisa said coldly. "So what do you want?" Kieran leaned forward, his voice low. "I want to burn the Zhorax to ash. I want to free every last human from their blood farms and make them choke on their own ichor. I can't do it alone. But if you help me, we can end them." Nisa's expression hardened. "You think I want to go back to that nightmare? I think you want revenge." He held her gaze. "And I think you want your body back." Her hands curled into fists. The parasite pulsed, almost in response to her anger. After a long silence, she exhaled shakily. "If we do this, you better have a plan. I'm not dying as a test subject." Kieran nodded. "We're not dying. Not until every last one of them is." The final member of the team was found in the icy orbit of Garlath's moon, where Kieran's ship touched down near a ramshackle outpost carved into the frozen cliffs. The cold bit through Kieran's coat as he stepped into the dim shelter where Zhorax was already waiting. Zhorax looked worse than Kieran remembered. His cybernetic arm, an old model designed for industrial labor, whirred faintly as he adjusted a heating coil. His face was weathered, his hair streaked with gray. But his eyes, cold and calculating, still burned with defiance. "You came back," Zhorax said without looking up. "You should have stayed away." "They're taking everything, Zhorax." Kieran stepped forward, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Virelia was just the start. They're draining planets dry." Zhorax's jaw tightened. "I told myself I was done fighting after what happened at Castaris. You didn't walk away from Castaris to let the Zhorax win." Kieran's voice softened. "You survived because you knew one day you'd have a chance to make it right." Zhorax looked up, eyes narrowing. "Make it right? You think you can win this?" "I know we can." Kieran extended a hand. "But I need you." Zhorax stared at Kieran's outstretched hand for a long moment. Then he grunted and clasped it, his cybernetic fingers cold as steel. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we do it my way. No half-baked heroics." Kieran managed a thin smile. "Wouldn't dream of it." By the time Kieran's ship left Garlath's orbit, the team was complete. In the cramped hold, Zhorax leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Nisa sat near the cockpit, checking her pulse monitor as the parasite within her shifted uneasily. Zhorax inspected the weapons cache, his mechanical fingers clicking against the metal. Kieran stood in the center, looking at the ragged group he'd assembled. They weren't heroes, they were survivors, each carrying scars from battles they shouldn't have lived through. But they were exactly what he needed. He exhaled slowly. "We're going after Hematica Prime, the largest Zhorax research station in this sector. If we can destroy it, we'll cripple their blood supply and buy humanity a chance to fight back." The room fell silent. Then Zhorax's grin returned, sharp as a blade. "Sounds suicidal." Nisa's eyes flashed. "Good." Zhorax nodded grimly. Let's make them bleed. Kieran's pulse pounded in his ears. The time for warnings was over. Then let's begin. The ship's alarms blared as Hematica Prime came into view. The massive Zhorax station hung in the void like a grotesque living organism, a sprawling tangle of bioorganic structures pulsing faintly with crimson light. Its surface shimmered with a membranous sheen, stretched over rib-like spires that jutted out at unnatural angles. Massive tendrils drifted into space, connected to smaller outposts feeding blood from captured colonies directly into the core. The entire construct seemed alive, each thrum of power like the beating of a corrupted heart. Kieran stood at the cockpit's viewport, fists clenched. The sight of the place made his skin crawl. He could almost hear the screams of the captives echoing through the void. Hematica Prime wasn't just a station. It was a slaughterhouse. Behind him, Zhorax tightened the straps on his plasma rifle. I've seen some hellscapes in my time, but this is something else. Nisa leaned against the bulkhead, her face pale but focused. Her parasitic implant twitched beneath her skin, sensing the Zhorax biosignatures even from this distance. She winced but forced herself upright. "Are we sure we're ready for this?" Zhorax asked. "We don't have a choice," Kieran replied. He turned to face the team. "If we don't destroy Hematica Prime, they'll bleed every human world in this sector dry." Zhorax sat cross-legged near the weapons cache, inspecting his blade, a jagged, obsidian-edged weapon coated in some kind of metallic resin. He grinned, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. Good. I was starting to get bored. Kieran checked the countdown on the ship's display. "We're in the gravity shadow, ready for insertion." Zhorax stood and slung his blade over his shoulder. "Let's wake the beast." The ship shuddered as Zhorax activated the manual override. The cloaking field hummed around them, shielding their presence from Zhorax biosensors. The ship slipped past the massive undulating hull and found an access point near one of the central conduits. Kieran moved to the airlock and grabbed his gear. "Once we're in, no hesitation. We disable the power relays and plant the detonation charges. If we stick to the plan, we'll be out before they know what hit them." Nisa exhaled slowly, eyes locked on the massive structure. "And if the plan fails?" Kieran didn't answer. The hatch hissed open, revealing the organic corridor leading into the station. The walls pulsed faintly, veins of glowing ichor coursing beneath the membrane-like surface. The air was thick and humid, reeking of copper and rot. Every breath tasted like blood. One by one, they stepped into the Zhorax hive. The corridors twisted in unnatural patterns, like the insides of some massive, living creature. The team moved silently, their boots squelching against the fleshy floor. Kieran led the way, his senses heightened by the faint hum of erindral blood coursing through his veins. He could feel the station breathing around him, could feel the faint thrum of life just beneath the surface. They reached the first chamber, a vast circular room filled with human captives suspended in grotesque organic pods. The pods pulsed rhythmically, pumping blood through thick tendrils connected to the ceiling. The humans inside were barely recognizable, gaunt, pale, their veins bulging as their life was drained drop by drop. Some were still alive, their eyes glazed and empty. Nisa clenched her fists. Monsters. Kieran motioned for the team to keep moving. They couldn't save them, not yet. If they stopped now, the entire mission would fail. Nissa hesitated but followed, her face hard with suppressed rage. They descended deeper into the hive, their path illuminated by the sickly red glow of the conduits. Strange, chittering sounds echoed through the tunnels, wet and inhuman. Kieran signaled for the team to halt as they approached the next chamber. Zhorax unsheathed his blade. Something's coming. A fleshy membrane at the far end of the corridor split open with a wet rip, and a grotesque figure emerged, a sanguidrone, its humanoid frame fused with Zhorax biomatter. Its arms were elongated, ending in barbed talons. Its face was half human, half alien, its jaw unnaturally stretched, its eyes sunken and empty. "Harvested," Leora whispered, horrified. "It's one of ours." The sanguidrones let out a guttural hiss and charged. Zhorax was the first to move. He swung his blade in a wide arc, severing the creature's arm at the joint. Thick ichor sprayed across the walls. The creature didn't slow. It lunged again, jaws snapping. Zhorax fired a plasma shot directly into its chest, blowing it apart in a burst of heat and gore. More chittering sounds echoed down the corridor. Kieran's heart sank as more sanguidrones shambled into view, half a dozen, their bodies twisted by layers of muscle and bone plating. "Run!" Kieran growled. The team sprinted toward the main core, the sanguidrones shrieking behind them. The corridor widened into a massive chamber, the air vibrating with the pulse of the blood-processing core. The heart of the station was a massive, pulsing sphere of flesh and machinery, suspended by thick tendrils that siphoned blood from every surrounding chamber. It throbbed with life, each pulse sending waves of crimson energy through the hive. Kieran skidded to a stop and turned. "Hold them off while I set the charges." Zhorax roared and leapt into the fray, his blade cleaving through another sanguidrone. Zhorax took cover behind a support column and unleashed a hail of plasma fire. Nissa stayed close to Kieran, her body trembling as the parasite within her reacted violently to the proximity of the Zhorax core. "Hurry," she muttered through gritted teeth. Kieran pulled out the detonation charges and began attaching them to the conduits. His hands shook, whether from exhaustion or the overload of his erindral blood. He didn't know. Sweat dripped down his face as he set the timer. A guttural roar echoed from the far end of the chamber. The walls rippled as a new figure emerged, a Zhorax general towering over the others. Its skin was fused with metallic armor, its wings formed from sinewy muscle stretched taut. It radiated power, its eyes glowing with malicious intelligence. "Zhorax!" Kieran shouted. "We need cover fire, now!" Zhorax fired shot after shot, but the general shrugged off the plasma bursts, its body regenerating almost instantly. It spread its wings and surged forward, talons slashing toward Kieran. Nissa screamed and lunged, her parasite-reactive body twisting in unnatural ways as she intercepted the general. The two collided, a mass of flesh and fury. The general's talons tore into Nissa's side, but she drove her fist into its face, her enhanced strength cracking its bone plating. Kieran set the final charge. "It's done!" Nissa was still grappling with the general, her face contorted in pain. The parasite in her veins pulsed wildly, spreading black veins across her skin. She turned to Kieran, her eyes wide but resolute. "Go," she whispered. "No." Kieran reached for her, but Threx grabbed his arm, dragging him toward the exit. Zhorax followed, covering their retreat with one last slash of his blade. Nissa's scream echoed through the chamber as the charges detonated. The explosion was deafening. A wave of fire and shrapnel tore through the core, severing the tendrils and incinerating everything in its path. The station trembled as the central sphere erupted, sending a shockwave of blood and debris through the hive. Kieran stumbled into the ship as the station began to collapse. Threx pulled him into the cockpit, and Zhorax sealed the hatch. They barely made it out as the hive imploded, collapsing in on itself in a massive fiery vortex. Kieran stared at the swirling wreckage in silence, his chest heaving. Nissa was gone, but the Zhorax had felt their first real defeat. He clenched his fists, feeling the slow, familiar burn of his blood. This was just the beginning. The silence was unbearable. The ship drifted in the void above the smoldering remains of Hematica Prime, the once monstrous station now reduced to shattered debris floating aimlessly. Flames still flickered in the cold vacuum, dying embers of the Zhorax's ambitions. But the victory felt hollow. Kieran Valdris sat alone in the ship's observation bay, staring into the ruins. His face was pale, his body trembling from exhaustion, and the strain of the Arindral blood coursing through his veins. The fight had been won, but not without sacrifice. Nissa's scream still echoed in his mind. Threx stepped into the room, his cybernetic arm whirring softly. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Kieran knew the look in his eyes, the same grief, the same guilt. Zhorax followed, his reptilian features unusually somber, his usual sharp grin absent. They'd all lost something in that hellish hive. "We have to finish this," Kieran said at last, his voice hollow but resolute. Threx nodded slowly. "You're thinking about the flagship." "The cradle," Kieran replied, his jaw tightening. "The command ship overseeing the entire blood farming network. If we take it out, the Zhorax Empire collapses. No more reinforcements, no more harvest." Zhorax's eyes gleamed. "Bold, suicidal, I like it." Threx hesitated. "We're barely holding together, Kieran. The ship's running on fumes. We've lost too much already." Kieran turned to face them, the veins beneath his skin pulsing darkly. "If we stop now, Nissa died for nothing. Everyone they drained, every world they bled, it'll all have been for nothing." Threx closed his eyes, shoulders sagging. He knew Kieran was right. After a moment, he opened them again. "Then let's finish it." The cradle was a monstrosity, a colossal ship resembling an elongated chrysalis, its surface veined with bioluminescent conduits of crimson light. It pulsed with energy, casting an ominous glow across the empty void like a distant heartbeat. Surrounding it were smaller dreadships, circling like vultures. The frigate shook violently as they dropped out of hyperspace. The ship's warning lights flared, a cruel reminder that their vessel was barely held together. Kieran tightened his grip on the controls, his knuckles white. "Cloaking's failing," Threx muttered as he adjusted the nav feed. They'll see us the second we breach their shields. Then we don't give them time to react, Kieran replied. He looked over his shoulder. Zhorax, get the cannons ready. Threx, set the overload core to manual. Threx's brows furrowed. You're really planning on doing this by hand? Kieran nodded grimly. If I don't, the failsafe might kick in. We can't risk this failing. Threx didn't argue. They were past doubts. The ship careened toward the cradle, a lone speck against the titanic vessel's surface. The Zhorax defenses flared, sensing their approach. Streams of bioplasma surged toward them, streaking the void with deadly precision. Brace! Kieran shouted. Threx angled the shields as Zhorax returned fire. The frigate spiraled past the defense grid, the hull groaning as plasma detonated around them. A direct hit clipped their left wing, sending them spinning. Kieran gritted his teeth and pulled them into a sharp descent, skimming just above the cradle's surface. There, Threx yelled, pointing at a glowing rift, a docking bay still exposed from the last maintenance cycle. Kieran didn't hesitate. The ship dove straight into the breach, crashing through layers of organic plating. The impact threw them forward as alarms blared. Sparks rained down and steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Everyone out! Kieran coughed, unstrapping himself. His ribs ached, but he ignored the pain. The team staggered into the docking bay. The inside of the cradle was worse than any Zhorax construct they'd seen. Its walls twitched and bled, veins bulging like a grotesque circulatory system. The air was thick with heat and the pungent stench of decaying flesh. Overhead, strange pods pulsed, filled with dark fluid and something alive. We're in the belly of the beast, Zhorax muttered, gripping his blade. Kieran activated the charge pack strapped to his chest. We head straight for the main reactor. We plant the core, and we end this. They moved quickly, but the ship felt aware, like it sensed the intruders within it. The floor undulated beneath their boots, sending tremors through the corridor. Zhorax drones began to emerge from the fleshy alcoves, their bodies grotesquely armored with overlapping bone plates. Their claws clicked against the floor, mandibles twitching with hunger. "Contact!" Threx yelled, raising his rifle. The first drone lunged and the hallway erupted into chaos. Zhorax leapt forward with a roar, his blade slicing cleanly through a drone's neck. Threx fired precise bursts, each shot burning through sinew and muscle. Kieran's blood surged, the veins along his arms darkening as his strength grew. He crushed one of the creatures with his bare hands, its bones snapping beneath his grip. But for every drone they killed, more emerged. "We're running out of time," Leora shouted, cutting down another drone. Kieran's gaze locked onto the corridor ahead. "We're close. Keep moving." They reached the reactor chamber, a massive spherical room dominated by a pulsating core of raw energy. It pulsed in erratic rhythms, its surface threaded with blood-red veins that writhed like living things. Kieran moved to the platform surrounding the core, pulling the overload device from his pack. The plan was simple: detonate the core, force the cradle to implode from within. He set the charges carefully, every second feeling like an eternity. A deafening roar shook the chamber. The Zhorax High Overlord descended from the shadows above. Its massive form was wreathed in armor, its wings stretched wide, dripping with ichor. Its eyes glowed like twin suns of fury, and its talons gleamed like obsidian blades. Zhorax cursed. "Oh, that's just unfair." The Overlord surged forward, faster than anything that size should be. It struck Zhorax first, knocking him across the room. He slammed into the wall with a sickening crack, but staggered back to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth. Zhorax fired point-blank into the Overlord's chest, but the plasma shots barely slowed it. The Overlord roared and impaled Zhorax with one claw, lifting him off the ground. Zhorax coughed blood, but he still managed a defiant grin. "Do it, Kieran," Zhorax rasped. "End this." With a final, brutal motion, the Overlord threw Zhorax aside. Kieran roared with rage, the power of his blood burning through his veins. He slammed into the Overlord, driving it back. His muscles screamed with pain as he held it in place, his strength surging beyond human limits. "Zhorax!" Kieran shouted. Zhorax, battered and bleeding, limped forward. He saw what Kieran was planning and nodded grimly. The charges were armed. The core throbbed violently, destabilizing. Kieran's voice was hoarse. "Get out." Zhorax hesitated, but then he turned, dragging Zhorax's limp body toward the exit. The Overlord thrashed, but Kieran held it firm, locking its talons with his own. His blood boiled beneath his skin, the veins writhing like black serpents. He could feel himself breaking apart, but he didn't care. "You wanted our blood," Kieran snarled. "Take it." With a final wrenching motion, he forced the Overlord into the core as the charges detonated. The explosion was blinding, a wave of heat and fire that consumed everything in its path. The cradle's massive structure split apart as the reactor imploded, sending shock waves through the void. Zhorax's ship burst from the wreckage, barely escaping the expanding firestorm. Inside the cockpit, Zhorax stared silently at the inferno behind him. The cradle, the heart of the Zhorax Empire, was gone. Survivors on liberated worlds watched the skies as Zhorax ships, leaderless and crippled, fell into disarray. The galaxy began to rebuild, slowly, painfully. But on some nights when the stars were quiet, they told stories of a man whose blood burned like fire, who faced the darkness so humanity could be free. Kieran Valdris was gone, but his legacy lived on.